Okay, so the Erie P1 class of 1914, the first and original triplex, is as good a place as any to start examining those four unusual locomotives. So let's take a look. Now, to understand the place of the triplexii in locomotive history, we also have to understand their place on the Erie Road. In 1907, the Erie ordered their first Malay compound locomotives. That's only a handful of years after Old Maud steamed into service. There's a video, check it out. So the Erie got in nice and early. Those first Erie locomotives were the L1 class. They were Wooton wide firebox, anthracite, waste coal burning, camelback locomotives. For want of a better description, they were super Mauds. They had an uptick in power, which came with an uptick in weight, which came with the necessity of having extra axles under all of that load. Thus, they were 0880 locomotives compared with Maud's 0660 wheel arrangement. As far as moving traffic on the Erie went at that time, during the first decade of the 20th century, those L1s were twice as powerful as the predominant 280, what you call consolidation types, what I call the Waru type. During the next decade of the 20th century, the Erie, along with many other roads, introduced what I call a Darrell, what you would call a Mike, a McMac, a Mac, a Calumet, or an 8-couple double-ender. That decade also saw the introduction of Santa Fe types. Also in that decade, some Russian decapods were added to the roster. Fast forward again to the 1920s and we see the introduction of Berkshire Superpower. So on the Erie, their 20th century freight hauling roster numbered somewhere around 1,000 locomotives, but with the obvious caveat that as the later types were introduced to traffic, the earlier types were shuffled out of service and to the scrap heap. It's not surprising that such a motive power hungry road would turn to Malay compound locomotives, but what is surprising is that that L1 class numbered all of 3 locomotives. So why only 3 super Mauds? That's because they were tasked with pushing eastbound traffic up one troubling grade, and a single super Maud could replace 2 Waru type locomotives. When those Darrell types and Santa Fe types came into service, train speeds picked up and train weights picked up. Therefore, the amount of traffic to be pushed up that grade during any locomotive day increased. Therefore, the equivalent of 3 Waru types were needed as pushers. So an L1 plus 1 more locomotive or a triplex. On the Erie, their triplexii showed a reasonable degree of utility, but on the Virginian, their single triplex was a bit of a failure. So let's check out the reasonable utility on the Erie. To paraphrase Churchwood, the start and end of a locomotive's ability to perform is the boiler. And the boiler on the first triplex had a 24-foot boiler barrel. It's not that difficult to find locomotives from that period with boiler barrels of that length. The only barrel I could find longer than 24 feet was on the Alco-built 210-10-2 locomotives, which I'll get to a bit later. It's worth comparing with what came after, because the Union Pacific 48841s or the Alleghenies had a 22-foot and 23-foot boiler barrel respectively. What the long boiler barrels perhaps suggests is an incomplete understanding of the utility of that length of boiler, because what was displayed in subsequent locomotives was that the steam generation utility in that extra couple of feet of boiler wasn't worth the weight of the longer boiler barrel. Like all locomotives that carry a wide firebox over the driving wheels, the firebox on the first triplex was quite shallow. As built, that firebox had a grate, a gaines wall, a floor, and a combustion chamber, albeit the combustion chamber was a bit smaller than what we would find on subsequent locomotives. After a trial period, the locomotive went back to Baldwin, the gaines wall was removed, and the floor converted into grate. So when you see references to the firebox being rebuilt, it's more a rejigging of the internal arrangements of the firebox. The Gaines wall was supposed to, amongst other things, stop loose material, clinker and the like, being drawn through the boiler tubes. The fact that it was removed by Baldwin points to one of the other issues with the triplexii, and that is the draft through the smoke box was only served by the exhaust steam from the lead engine. So significantly less draft when compared to other big boilered locomotives. The relatively small furnace serving a relatively large boiler barrel were design choices. The shallowness of that firebox and the limited draft up the chimney were design prices paid for having that third engine underneath the tender. What I think is that Baldwin were hoping that the combination of the superheater, the feed water heater, and the mechanical stoker were enough to make up for that shallow firebox and that lesser draft. There's a school of thought that says that the rear engine was exhausted up the back of the tender to minimise back pressure in that engine, but I don't think that's the case, because it would create an asymmetric situation compared to the other two engines, because the other two engines were subject to more back pressure. I think the explanation is the distance from that trailing engine to the smoke box and the utility of having that exhaust steam pass through a feed water heater. In terms of that third engine, there's a criticism that the using of fuel and water lessened the adhesive weight on that engine, but I think that's misplaced. We need to remember that the locomotives were designed to push up a grade that was only 7 3/4 of a mile long. So there was never any particular danger of the locomotive running short of fuel and water. And of course the shallow ash pan that would have needed cleaning throughout the working day, thus creating opportunities to refuel and re-water. Now, implicit in all of that is that some of the fuel and water in the tender would have been acting as ballast, but, so what? The whole 6 mile long train passing at 4 miles per hour needs to be unpacked. That's a reference to what the triplexii could theoretically do. The reality is somewhat different. The only occasions these locomotives led trains is during tonnage tests. And yes, during those tonnage tests, the odd coupler was broken, but these locomotives are hardly Robinson Crusoe when it comes to breaking couplings. They were never intended to be road locomotives, they were always intended to push. So let's take a look at the grade up which they slogged out their working lives. It's only 7.75 miles up the east side and 6.75 miles down the west side. So a peanuts grade compared to, say, the Continental Divide or the grade on the Virginian, which I'll get to a bit later. But for shifting traffic on the Erie, it was a considerable operational bottleneck. The 4 miles per hour is a reference to the performance of the Virginian triplex. On the Erie, the triplexii in service rarely exceeded 10 miles per hour. That doesn't sound like much, but we need to remember that the L1 class did the same job at 5 miles per hour. Thus, the triplexii were pushing more, considerably faster. Not really a word that I would associate with the P1 class, save for the visual effect of seeing 3 engines under one locomotive. There's a contention that one of the articles of failure is that the boiler couldn't supply steam to all 6 cylinders when running simple. This is kind of a variation on the argument that a Y6B could out tractive effort a Union Pacific 48841 when operating simple. Sure it could, but what's the point? When starting one of these big beasts, the driver simply introduced steam to the receivers before starting the locomotive. That way, the high pressure engine did not have to charge the receivers before the low pressure engines came into work. Now, one of the flaws of the triplexii as they performed in service is that the centre engine developed more power than the leading engine and the trailing engine. And one of the realities of the design was that the centre engine did not carry more adhesive weight to match that power. So at a full power setting in less than ideal traction conditions, the centre engine could become prone to slip. The way to alleviate that slip would have been to pull back on the power settings, but that means that the mean effective pressure in the middle engine is less than ideal, which means that its tractive effort is less, which also has downstream effects on the trailing and leading engine, in that their tractive effort is also reduced, and the draft up the chimney is reduced, and the heat transferred through the feed water heater is likewise reduced. Now, on a dry rail that might not have been a problem, but on a wet rail it's easy to see that drawing back on the power settings for that centre engine would have affected the overall performance of all three engines. Still, we need to bear in mind that the Erie, after a full year of service with the triplex, ordered 2 more examples, and that has to mean something. I can't help but wonder, because this is the sort of thing I like to wonder about, if the triplexii would have performed better if they had a high capacity boiler like, say, the big nines had. And who knows, in some parallel universe somewhere it might be that the triplexii were the beginning of all that followed. But in our reality, the understanding of high capacity boilers came later, and the classic example of that knowledge is with the Berkshire 284 superpower locomotives. And when the superpower locomotives came into service on the Erie, they relegated older but still reasonably powerful types into secondary service. And those locomotives took over the banking roles from the triplexii, and thus they were relegated into standby roles and ultimately sent for scrap. They were actually withdrawn before the L1 class, and whilst being outlasted by the locomotives that on paper you were supposed to replace isn't necessarily a measure of failure, it certainly isn't a measure of success either. The best quote I can find about the performance of the triplexii on the Erie is that they were, quote, end quote, spotty. Brief word about the Virginian triplex, and in the context of what came before the type and what came after. So we have the Erie L1, the Erie P1, the Virginian XA, and the Virginian AE. The first and last are Alco products. Alco at that time was under the influence of Francis Cole, who sits up high on the top shelf of American locomotive engineers. The triplexii in the middle are, of course, Baldwin products. Baldwin's chief engineer at that time was Mr. Henderson, who today is primarily remembered for a collection of questionable locomotive patents. The two Alco types were quite well balanced in terms of their furnace's ability to generate heat and their boiler's capacity to turn that heat into usable steam. With the two Baldwin products, I've already discussed the boiler performance for the Erie triplexii, but let's have a look at the Virginia triplex, because it makes interesting comparison with the first three. Overall, it's lighter, it's lower drivered, it has smaller cylinders, it has significantly more boiler capacity, it has a furnace that's roughly the same size as its precedent types on the Erie. It was intended to push on a grade that was roughly twice as long and roughly twice as steep as the Gulf Summit grade, and it was intended to push at roughly half the speed that the Erie triplexii could muster. So it had a significantly hungrier task before it in terms of steam demand than that found on the Erie. And it's that Virginian triplex, coupled together with the USRA taking responsibility for the design parameters of road Mallet locomotives, that marked the end of Baldwin's misadventures in Mallet compound articulators. So on balance, the Erie jobs weren't exactly a failure, but they also weren't exactly a sparkling success. The Virginian example, though, remains a real head scratcher. Thanks to Philip from Milepost 51 for lending me the gradient profile. He's got a ton of information about the L1s on his website. It's worth a look to check out perhaps the most unusual Malay articulators to roll into service on North American roads. So that's it. Like, subscribe, enjoy. See you next time.